Family from Tolstoy's 1,500-page masterpiece about the Napoleonic Wars. This is about an hour.
Thank you, Anton. And War and Peace you cannot read in one sitting, but my book you can. I just want to thank the owners of Politics and Prose, Bradley Graham and Lissa Muscatine, for the invitation to come here tonight. Not everyone gets to speak at this incredible bookstore, so it is really an honor to receive an invitation. And also Abby Fenwald has helped to organize this event. And it's particularly special for me to be speaking about Tolstoy at Politics and Prose, not just because Politics and Prose is, one of the probably the most famous independent bookstore in the country, but also because Politics and Prose is where my cousin Helene, who's sitting in the back row, got me my very first Tolstoy finger puppet. And they don't sell them here anymore. And Anton mentioned this to me. And this has been a mainstay of my talks on Tolstoy for the past, 7 or 8 years. So I feel as if we have come home tonight. And in honor of this special event, I'm going to leave him on my finger during the whole talk. Just kidding. I'm not going to do that. But he's here for inspiration for all of us. And during Q&A, if you really would like him to be present with me, I'm happy to put him back on my finger. So one of the first questions I get when people see the cover of this book is, cool picture, where'd you get the picture? Ladies and gentlemen, Exhibit A, my copy of War and Peace. This is a book that has been well loved, a book that has been lived through, lived with, struggled with, engaged with, tossed around a bit. Tolstoy and I have been together for almost 25 years. In fact, I met Tolstoy before I met War and Peace. It has been one of the longest relationships of my life. And as my wife, Corinne, always reminds me when she sees me gently caressing the pages of this book, it has also been one of the most intense relationships of my life. We've had our ups and our downs, Tolstoy and I, that is. We've had our disagreements, our separations. I even went through a divorce, so I thought it was a divorce. I refused to read a word of Tolstoy for a couple of years after graduate school for reasons that I can talk to you about later. But as with any good relationship that lasts, every couple of years or so, I rediscover the reasons that I fell in love with Tolstoy in the first place. And one of those moments came for me in 2009 when I was invited to teach a workshop, an hour-and-a-half workshop in a prison, an adult prison, about a short story by Tolstoy called The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a famous short story about a middle-aged guy who contracts a fatal illness and has to come to terms with how he's lived his life. Have never been to a prison before, had no idea what to expect. And I will tell you, it was the most powerful teaching experience of my career up to that point. Because this story, not War and Peace, but a smaller one, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, became a vehicle for these men who had read the story, these men who were incarcerated, to share with me decisions that they had made in their own lives, decisions that they perhaps regretted. They shared with me and one another experiences that they've had with death, people that they've watched die. And all of a sudden, a conversation about Russian literature became a conversation about real life. And it struck me that that is what I've always loved about Russian literature and about Tolstoy in particular. The ability of his art, his fiction, to engage an incredibly wide range of people in meaningful, authentic conversation about the things that matter to all of us as human beings. What Russians sometimes call the accursed questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And how should I live? And this is what I've always loved about War and Peace as well. I've read War and Peace maybe 15 times. I haven't been counting, but around 15 times. And each time I read it, it comes alive for me in a new way, which is what a classic does. I mean, a classic is a book that grows with you and changes over time with you. As you change, you have a relationship with it. So each time I've encountered this book, it's a new book. Well, in 2008, I came to see it in an entirely new way again, as my family went through a serious financial crisis. Now, I'm not going to give you the details of that crisis. If you want some of those details, you have to read the book. But suffice it to say that it was a serious enough crisis that it felt as if the bottom had dropped out from underneath me. Some of my most basic assumptions about the world, about myself, about life, were challenged. And I realized, because I was reading War and Peace at the time, why? Because I was finishing another book about Tolstoy back then. That's why I was rereading War and Peace. And suddenly it struck me that this is a book about a society going through a crisis. This book takes place during Russia's wars with Napoleon in the early 1800s and eventually describes Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia in 1812. This is a world in which people's lives are being turned upside down by the forces of war and social change and spiritual confusion. And the question that so many of Tolstoy's characters are asking is, how do I find fulfillment and even happiness in such troubled times? Well, that's a question that I was asking very personally back in 2008, as many of us were. And it's a question that many of us are still asking today in 2014. So War and Peace, I realized, is the classic for our time. And I also realized that I had to write another book about Tolstoy. That's what this discovery led me to. As I mentioned, I was finishing another book. And I wanted it to be a book about War and Peace. I wanted to write a book that would take this massive, intimidating novel of world literature. I can't tell you how many people have said, oh my God, I've tried to start this thing. I can't get through 20 pages, all those characters, all those funny names, or people who are terrified to start the book at all. It's a shame because this book has such a wealth of wisdom for those of us living today. So what I wanted to do is to take this big, intimidating book and just bring it down to a very human, relatable level. I wanted to guide readers in a very accessible way through the themes, the characters, the historical context of the novel. But even more importantly, I wanted to guide readers through a conversation about the wisdom that this book can offer us on a wide range of topics. And I chose 12 themes. These are the titles of my 12 chapters, and I look at them because I always forget one. And the themes are plans, imagination, rupture, success, idealism, happiness, love, family, courage, death, perseverance, and truth. So if any of those apply to any of you, that's your book. And in the process of talking about these themes, I don't do it in an abstract way. I do it by taking readers through the journeys of the characters themselves, because that's what War and Peace does. And at the same time, I interweave the stories from Tolstoy's own life, in which he was grappling with many of these same issues and themes. And I also interweave the stories from my own 25-year journey with Tolstoy, because so much of my understanding and thinking about these issues has been shaped in some way by Tolstoy and by War and Peace in particular, a novel which I sometimes jokingly refer to as my secular Talmud. I'm Jewish. And then the other aspect of the book that people have appreciated is that as you're moving through Give War and Peace a Chance, you're also moving through the plot of War and Peace. So it's as if one phrase I used, which my editor and publicist don't like me to use anymore, was it's kind of like a Cliff Notes on steroids. But if you don't like that, the way to describe it is that it works well as a companion for those of you reading the book, but it also works well as a standalone book in case you don't have plans in the very near future to read War and Peace. Everything you need to know for the cocktail party is in this book. And of course, I'm being slightly facetious. One of the first chapters I wrote was called Rupture. And that would make sense that that's one of the first chapters, because that was the impetus behind the writing of the book in the first place. And I use the word rupture because it gets at what I was after. Not just crisis, but rupture. When things seem to fall apart, when your most fundamental paradigms about who you are, about what the world is about, no longer hold. Well, these moments of rupture, Tolstoy believed, are also incredible moments of opportunity for us not only to tap into sources of strength and creativity that we maybe never knew we had, but also to tap into kinds of understanding and insights about the world that we often don't have during more ordinary, smooth-flowing times. And a good example of this in the book comes early when the character Nikolai Rostov, who's one of the heroes of the novel, he's still a young man, he's a young aristocratic man, he loses 43,000 rubles at the gambling table. He has a gambling addiction, as did Tolstoy. More about that in a minute. And he is utterly ashamed at what he's done because his father is now having financial difficulties. His father had lent him money recently, and so he is distraught and ashamed over what he's done. He goes home, and one of the first things that he wants to do is put a bullet in his head. But instead of putting a bullet in his head, he does something else. He listens to his sister, Natasha, sing. And he is so transported by the beauty of her voice that he simply forgets about his problems and he doesn't want the day to end. How many times has Nikolai actually heard his sister singing at home? Hundreds of times probably. But in that moment, on the heels of his own personal crisis, maybe for the first time, he's actually heard her. Well, it was in the context of my own crisis in which I actually heard the beauty of that scene for the first time. And I want to share with you a little bit about that discovery that I describe in my book. One dreary afternoon, I was sitting in my rented Charlottesville, Virginia home and closed the curtains, wallowing in self-pity, when a funny thing happened. I started filing through a collection of old CDs and put on some random clarinet concertos by Carl Maria von Weber. It had been about 20 years since I'd last heard those pieces, around the time I quit playing the clarinet myself. Slouched there on the couch with my laptop, clicking back and forth between Outlook Express and the Palm Pilot desktop, I listened. I still don't know why, but as that clarinet sang over the orchestra, now with sad, sweet cadences, now with forceful, angry passion, something was kindled inside me. Memories of childhood assailed me, including images of my clarinet playing. But it went beyond mere memory. I stood up, closed my eyes, and let those sounds wash over me, my body swaying to a beauty and mystery well beyond myself. There I was in the middle of my messy living room in my unexceptional Charlottesville house, with the throw pillows strewn about and my poor incontinent cat's crap stains amending the carpeting, and for a moment I was terribly happy. What are Ponzi schemes and stock markets and washout shysters in such a moment? Everything seemed irrelevant in comparison to that opening into eternity I glimpsed. How many times I'd read and enjoyed that scene in which Nikolai listens to Natasha sing, but only now, in the aftermath of my own personal crisis, did I realize, for perhaps the first time, what that scene is about. Tolstoy is describing what you feel when your world has crashed, the ground beneath you has cracked open, and all you want to do is go to sleep. But then, out of nowhere, you hear or see something so beautiful, so strikingly real, that you suddenly awaken into a new consciousness, hoping the day never ends. Another theme that I talk about in the book is one that obsessed Tolstoy. All of these themes obsessed him, but this one, success. He desperately, from a very young age, wanted to be successful, very successful. In fact, in his diaries, in his 20s, he wrote, "I'm afraid that if I had to choose between fame and virtue, I would choose fame." And so he desperately wanted to achieve success. He was terrified about actually achieving it for all the wrong reasons. And then when he did achieve it, he felt like he was a failure. He hadn't done enough, or hadn't done enough of the right things. So here he is, the 52-year-old author of both War and Peace and Anna Karenina, internationally famous writer, takes a miserable 4-day trek by foot in peasant garb and wooden sandals across the Russian countryside to a nearby monastery in order to talk to a monk and ask that monk what he should do with his life. And apparently he didn't get the response that he wanted, because the very next day he returned home by train, first class. And this is kind of an extreme story, but I think that the element of this story that we can all relate to is the question that Tolstoy was grappling with, which is, what is success? How do I know when I've been successful? How do I know when I've arrived? How much is enough? Well, the character in War and Peace that grapples with this question very directly is Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, who, when the novel opens, is in his late 20s. He has everything. He's got brains, he's got breeding, he's got family connections, he's even got a beautiful pregnant wife, and he's on his way to being successful, but none of it is good enough for him. So he abandons his wife and his pregnant wife. He goes off to the battlefield, and on the night before the Battle of Austerlitz, he dreams that next day he is going to single-handedly lead the Russians to victory over the French, and finally he is going to achieve the glory that he has so long desired. Well, what actually happens the next day is that as he runs off into the battlefield with the other soldiers, one of the first things that happens is an enemy soldier's bayonet whacks him over the head, knocks him onto the ground, he falls on his back, he looks up at the sky, and all he sees is the immense, beautiful sky with the clouds creeping across it. And he asks himself, in that moment of reverie, how is it I haven't seen this lofty sky before? And this is from my book. Good question. How is it any of us fails to see the bigger picture as we so often do, confusing the contentment we seek with the narrower visions of conquest we pursue? Like Andrei, we frequently misunderstand the true nature of reality. Life, Tolstoy says, isn't a fast elevator shooting us up to the top floor, but a continuous river of individual moments flowing endlessly into one another. The Battle of Austerlitz, which would go down in history as a terrible loss for Russia, is one of the great moments of Prince Andrei's life, but not for the reasons he might have thought. The majesty of battle would seem to be his for the taking, or at least the taking in, when wham, life in the form of a soldier's bayonet hits him over the head and knocks him into a new consciousness. Through the haze of his blurred vision, he sees clearly for the first time the immensity of the universe, indifferent to his worldly plans and ambitions. And for a brief moment, he gets it. I skip a few paragraphs. If you ask any ordinary Russian today what exactly happened at the Battle of Austerlitz, most would be hard-pressed to remember much of anything about that military campaign except for one little thing. That stirring moment in War and Peace when Tolstoy's hero has that powerful epiphany while gazing wounded up at the glorious sky. Such is the power of Tolstoy's art, not to mention the accuracy of his insight. Our greatest and most enduring personal triumphs, Tolstoy observes, are seldom the ones described in the headlines or the history books. They don't appear on the scoreboards or in our public celebrations. More often than not, they are those transformative moments we experience in the quiet inwardness of our souls when the cameras are turned off and nobody is watching. Except for God, that is, and Tolstoy. Now, my editor wanted me to take out the mention of God in that sentence, and I didn't. The rationale behind that is interesting, and I'll share it with you during Q&A if you're interested. But right here, the point I want to make is that Tolstoy was not God. He was about as far from God as human beings get. He was a deeply flawed man. He had a gambling addiction, just like Nikolai Rostov. When he was 26 years old, he lost the house of his birth in a gambling bet during a night at the card table when he lost 6,000 rubles, and he had to send a letter home asking his family, what do we have that we can sell that's worth 6,000 rubles? I can't pay off this debt. So guess what? The house is what he sold. And if you go to Russia today, if you go to Yasnaya Polyana, which is Tolstoy's museum and estate, you will see in the middle of the estate a large unkempt field. At the edge of one of those, at the edge of the field is a little stone, about 15 millimeters high, on which are written the words, "Here stood the house in which Leo Tolstoy was born." Well, it was carted off by horse-drawn trailers and taken to a nearby village. And by the way, I think in 1913 it had never been lived in, and it was used. The wood was used as firewood, and the brick was used as rubble. He was very ashamed. In his diary, Tolstoy wrote that I want to forget about my own existence on the day that happened. Well, 2 weeks later, you open his diary and you read, played cards again, lost another 200 rubles. I can't promise to stop. Tolstoy had a voracious sexual appetite. He sired an illegitimate child to a local peasant girl when he was in his 20s, which is all the more interesting if you consider the fact that later on in life, he passionately preached celibacy, both in and out of marriage. Hypocritical for someone who fathered 13 children and one illegitimate child, and his wife made sure that he never forgot just how hypocritical he was. He also could be wildly impractical. He gave away all of the copyrights to all of his works that were published before 1881, and this includes Anna Karenina and War and Peace, because he thought it was immoral for him and his family to profit from his own labors. His wife was infuriated. She said, "How can you do this? You've got a family to support. You're a father. You have responsibilities." To this day, that decision is still discussed in the Tolstoy family. When I was at Yasna Polyana a few summers ago, giving a talk, it was during the Q&A session, and in the audience were Tolstoy's great-great-grandson and great-great-great-grandson, and I simply threw out the question for the heck of it. So what do you guys think, as in the audience? Do you think he made the right decision? And it was fascinating to listen to the great-great-grandson say, yes, he made the right decision because he didn't want his works of art to be turned into a commodity. And the great-great-great-grandson, who was 20 years old at the time and looking for a job, said, well, making money is also just as important as moral responsibility. So the debate continues. And I'm not going to tell you which side I'm on. You have to read the book for that. Finally, Tolstoy ran away from home at the age of 82. That fight over the copyright was one of many fights that he had with his wife. It soured their relationship. And when he was 82 years old, he ran away from home and he left his wife of 48 years a note, thanking her for 48 years of marriage, but telling her that their differences are irreconcilable, that he wants to go off and die alone, and please do not come after me. It's a tragic story that was beautifully captured in the movie The Last Station, based on the novel of the same name by Jay Perini. So here's the thing, though. Tolstoy brought all of those flaws, all of those quirks, all of those contradictions to his characters. And that's what makes his characters so real and relatable, in War and Peace at least. He's not preaching to us from on high. He's talking about life from the point of view of someone who's actually experienced it in all of its ups and its downs, and someone who had, and whose characters' journeys look very much like our journeys. These are not perfect people. And that's one of the reasons that so many readers can relate to Tolstoy's characters. And what's more, that this man who saw his own flaws as painfully as anyone has ever seen their own flaws, and who also saw and described the flaws of his characters as perfectly as any writer has ever captured on the page, also had a profound faith in human possibility. Tolstoy once wrote, quote, "Man is flowing. In him there are all possibilities. He was stupid, now he is clever. He was evil, now he is good, and the other way around. In this is the greatness of man." And it is this optimism rooted in reality that has inspired so many readers, including the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, who, when Gandhi was 24 years old, was given a copy of The Kingdom of God is Within You, a famous essay by Tolstoy. And Gandhi would later say that this essay would be one of the most transformative pieces of writing that he encountered in his life. Tolstoy inspired our own Martin Luther King. And Nelson Mandela, when he was incarcerated at Robben Island, was given a copy of War and Peace to read. And he would later say that it was his favorite novel. War and Peace, in his darkest hour, Nelson Mandela turned to War and Peace for consolation and inspiration. Tolstoy once said, "The hero of my tale is truth," with a capital T. It's a scary word to use in Washington, D.C. But what he meant by that is not his truth, or my truth, or your truth, or the conservatives' truth, or the liberals' truth, or the Christians, or the Jews, or the Muslims. No, the truth that encompasses all of us, the truth of our shared humanity. Tolstoy reminds us through his nearly 600 characters in War and Peace that we are all on this path, in this journey, together. We all know what it means to love and to lose. We all know what it means to search for our purpose in this world. We all know what it means to grapple with death. Suffering, Tolstoy helps us to see, is universal. And that is part of what brings us together. And this is a lesson that Natasha Rostova learns in a very poignant way later in the book. Natasha is in her late teens. She's a young aristocratic woman who's been through a lot. And she has just been grieving over the loss of someone very dear to her. And she thinks that nobody in her family can understand what she's going through. Everything is so humdrum. Everything is so boring. Life has no meaning. No one can understand. Well, then she and her family get the news that one of her brothers, not Nikolai, but another brother, has just died in battle. And this is what happens. Natasha, not yet aware of what has happened, notices her father stumbling over to a chair into which he collapses, and covering his eyes, he begins to weep. In an instant, she is transformed from self-absorbed child back to keenly aware adult. Tolstoy describes this sudden shift of perspective as an experience of almost physical violence. Quote, this is from the novel, "She felt a terrible pain. It seemed to her that something had torn inside her and she was dying. Seeing her father and hearing her mother's terrible coarse cry from behind the door, she instantly forgot herself and her grief." End quote. In fact, Tolstoy goes on, quote, "This was the way Natasha's wound healed. She thought her life was over, but suddenly her love for her mother showed her that the essence of life, love, was still alive in her. Love awoke and life awoke." End quote. Love awoke and life awoke. These 5 words strike to the very core of War and Peace. To love, Tolstoy says, is to see. To see is to know the truth. And to know the truth is to truly live. No wonder then that this novel, chock full of clear, honest reflection about the pain of living, is also one of the most life-affirming works of fiction one will encounter. In Russian, the word for peace in the title War and Peace is mir. Mir has multiple meanings in Russian, and one of them is world, cosmos. So when a Russian is hearing the title War and Peace, at some subconscious level, they're also hearing war and the world. As if to suggest, there are many ways to interpret this, but one way I'd like to suggest is that life, the world, is about battle. It is about struggle. It is about movement and change. And if we are to find our peace, our contentment, our happiness, we're not going to find it out there in some idealized, abstract realm. We're not going to find it through following 7 rules to universal happiness. We're going to have to fight for it and make mistakes, and we're going to find it right down here in the rough and tumble of our imperfect world and within our own imperfect selves. And nobody embodies this wisdom more powerfully than the character of Pierre Bezukhov, one of my favorite characters in the novel. You'll learn a lot about him and give War and Peace a chance. But he has just been sentenced to execution. He's a prisoner of war with the French. He's a French prisoner of war. He's just been sentenced to execution. Well, he thinks he's been sentenced to execution. Actually, it's a cruel joke that the authorities play on him and the other prisoners. They bring him to witness an execution, though he thinks he's going to die. Well, watching that factory worker, that blindfolded factory worker, get shot in the head, and watching the other prisoners die is enough to shatter Pierre's every conceit about his own power, every belief in God, in the good order of the universe. And after that experience, he is tossed into a shed, and there he meets a man. The man sitting next to Pierre is Platon Karatayev, an old peasant who has ended up in French captivity while serving a mandatory 25-year sentence in the Russian Imperial Army as punishment for once having trespassed on a neighbor's property. No stranger to suffering himself, Platon knows what Pierre is going through, and so he consoles the young fellow not only with his soothing words, but by doing something seemingly quite unremarkable. He gives Pierre some potatoes. Now, these are not the first potatoes Pierre has ever eaten. If you've ever glanced at a menu in a Russian restaurant, you know that Russians have as many ways of preparing this ubiquitous national vegetable as Eskimos have of naming snow. But these might be the first potatoes he has ever really tasted. More than physical nourishment, these modest little hunks of carbohydrate, handed to him in an act of simple kindness, are spiritual sustenance as well. Reconnecting him to the human family, to the earth, to himself, they bring Pierre back to life. His spiritual rebirth then begins not under the intoxicating influence of any of those grand plans, or indeed from the realm of heroic fantasy, but in the fulfillment of his most basic bodily needs. Seldom have the ordinary rhythms of everyday life or the details of his immediate surroundings so enraptured Pierre. Rarely has he immersed himself so fully and yet so unpretentiously in the greatest pleasure of all, the joy of simply being alive. There in that dark shed, on the darkest day of his life, Pierre touches something solid and transcendent in his now pulverized world. He glimpses that elusive it, the real thing. We've all had that moment when our ordinary, perhaps even crummy life suddenly strikes us as something pretty extraordinary after all. Just when you're ready to throw in the towel over a job, a relationship, an addiction, an illness, over life itself, grace may magically intervene, illuminating a fresh possibility you hadn't imagined, offering an entirely new way of seeing an all too familiar problem. Ah, now it makes sense, you are tempted to shout. You don't, of course, for you've discovered a secret gift that need not be advertised to the world. And that private little heaven is what we have earned by marching through hell. Had Pierre merely been told that he might have achieved that illumination by following the prepackaged advice offered by the Freemason Bazdiev all those chapters back, his discovery surely would have seemed less striking, dull and cheap even. His realization in captivity is so compelling to him and thus to the reader in direct proportion to how long he has had to fight in order to achieve it. For 7 years we've followed this young man through the ups and downs of his tumultuous journey as he careers from one grand failure to another. To find any nuggets of wisdom, he has first had to dig deep in the dirt, sift well through the dross. He has had to go through the war, in short, before he could find his peace. The goal of an artist, Tolstoy once said, and this is a quote, the goal of an artist is not to solve a question irrefutably, but to force people to love life in all of its countless, inexhaustible manifestations. If I were told that I could write a work of art in which all of the social questions of today would be resolved, I wouldn't spend 2 hours on such a work. But if I knew that what I write will be read by the children of today in 20 years and that they will laugh and weep and fall in love with life because of it, then I would dedicate all of my energy and all of my time to such a work. End quote. War and Peace is such a work, and I invite you to join me on a journey through it. Thank you.
I have two factual questions. How did Tolstoy manage to do all the research he did for this book? I mean, someone with Google would be. That's unbelievable. And the second thing was, what was the physical act of writing? So in other words, taking it to the publishers, the printers, and so forth.
So in terms of the research that he did, he was a voracious reader. And in preparation for writing War and Peace, he read several hundred history books about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, which took place 50 years before he wrote War and Peace, because he wrote it in the 1860s. And he thought all of them were bunk. He thought none of the history books accurately captured the richness of history or the truth about the forces that move history. And so he was going to prove them all wrong with War and Peace. And I talk about this in the book. But the bottom line is he did a lot of research, which is why the historical facts, the historical descriptions in this book are so accurate and so true to life, and which is why they still resonate with us today. In terms of the publication history, War and Peace actually came out in installment form in what was called a thick journal. There were a thick journal, which is essentially a literary journal, like the Russian version of the New Yorker, but a lot thicker and a lot more divisive and virulent than the New Yorker. And it came out over a 5-year period from 1865 through 4-year period, from 1865 to 1868. It was finalized in 1869. And so readers, and Tolstoy didn't know where this book was going. Part of the excitement of War and Peace is he had no idea how the plot would unfold. Early readers of the novel couldn't figure out what this thing is. Is this a novel? Is this a historical epic? Is this a historical poem? What are you doing here? It breaks all of the rules of good, elegant European history writing. They couldn't figure out who the hero was because Tolstoy didn't introduce his hero in the way that so many 19th century novelists did, with a long background about their past. He just throws us in. No hors d'oeuvres or anything, one of my book club readers said. He just throws us right in the middle. The book opens in French. 2.5% of this book happens to be written in French. Russia's great national epic, 2.5% of it is written in French for reasons that I talk about in the book. So it was published in installment form, and it broke all of the rules of good novel writing. And the other thing I would add is that if it were not for Tolstoy's wife, we would not have War and Peace. Because every day, and he was an aristocrat. He was independently wealthy. He didn't have to work. He had 300 serfs basically preparing. So he could wake up in the morning and have his coffee and send the kids off to the nanny and the governess and whoever else. And he would go to his writing room, until noon, and then he would be served lunch, and then he'd spend the rest of the afternoon there. But in the evening, when he was done writing, he would hand the pages of the manuscript that he produced that day to his wife and send his poor wife, who was probably pregnant the whole time, 13 kids, she was, into her boudoir until late in the night to rewrite, to copy everything that he wrote into handwriting that was legible enough for him to understand, because he couldn't even read his own handwriting. And it would be waiting for Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy the next morning at his writing desk. If it were not for Sonia Tolstoy, and I give her her due, her very much deserved due in this book, if it were not for her, we would not have War and Peace. Because Tolstoy was also lazy, if you want to add. He was a hard worker, but he could also be incredibly lazy, if you want to add that to the list of flaws that I went through. So I'm not sure how this speaking works. Do people stand in line to the...
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I read War and Peace 50 years ago, and I need to read it again. But this is a Russian classic. What do Russians take from it? I mean, it's a foundational piece, like I suppose Mark Twain is here, or any one of our big-time 19th century authors. What do they make of it?
That's a great question.
Okay.
And I feel like I should drag Anton up here to answer that. But let me give it a shot. And if Anton, who was born in Russia and spent, I think, 17 years there, and read it in high school, if he has something to add, I would love to invite him to do so. But War and Peace has for 25 years, 30 years, I think through the whole Soviet period, has been required reading.
I'm sure.
Of every Soviet and then Russian school child. 10th grade is the grade that they're required to read it in. And there's a well-known secret that the girls read the peace sections and the boys read the war sections. And they're both missing the point for reasons that I talk about in the book. So that's a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, what it means is that everybody is familiar with this classic, even more so than Americans are familiar with our own classics. But But it also meant that a lot of readers felt like War and Peace was being shoved down their throats. And so a number of students that go through that experience are turned off by War and Peace, are turned off by the classics. And in fact, in 1990, in the early 1990s, when Glasnost and Perestroika were still very strong in Russia, there were a lot of articles in Russia. It was very fashionable to basically say that Tolstoy no longer belongs on the required reading lists. That maybe we should get rid of, because what does Tolstoy understand about 20th century tragedy? What could he possibly understand about things like the Holocaust? And that's most unfortunate because, as I hope I've explained and I show in the book, he's vitally relevant to the world that we live in today. And the only other thing that I would say is that in spite of the mixed reaction that Russians have today to War and Peace, if you sit in a taxi cab in Moscow, the taxi cab driver, if you say Natasha Rostova, he or she will know exactly who you're talking about. He or she will have his or her favorite scene with Natasha, and will probably even get into a debate with you about your interpretation of that character. So War and Peace is part of Russians' blood. And I think we saw that in the Olympics, the Sochi Olympics, when 20 minutes of the opening ceremonies were dedicated to a ballet of War and Peace. So it is still very much in the Russian blood. And what I think is needed now in Russia is an approach to teaching it which helps contemporary students kind of see the relevance of it and not just see it as a required piece of literature.
I would think it's as central to their culture as Shakespeare is to ours.
I would agree with you.
I just wonder what the Russianness of it. I mean, I remember Dostoevsky better, but there's a passion and an inward. They all think a lot, not rationally, emotionally.
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to talk about something like Russianness, not because it's not a great question, but Putin does a lot of talking about Russianness right now, and it's very important when one talks about Russianness to make sure it does not devolve into some kind of a nationalist discourse, as it has with Putin. But what's Russian about War and Peace, if I have to pinpoint it, is precisely the universalism. What makes the character of Commander-in-Chief Kutuzov such a powerful character and an ideal in Tolstoy's mind is and makes him so Russian is because his ability to accept everyone and his ability to be humble. Humility, not hubris. And if there's one character in War and Peace that Putin most resembles, it is not the Russian. It is the French invader, Napoleon, who represents the value of hubris. But that's not the message of War and Peace. It's a message of humility and acceptance. And therein lies, in my view, its Russianness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you written a book about emotional intelligence without using the term at all?
The question is, have I written a book about emotional intelligence without using the term at all? I'm not sure. Is this a book about emotional intelligence? Say more. I'm interested. Where should I help me? The second edition, emotional intelligence, will be in there.
Well, I think you have. I think you should read Daniel Goleman on emotional intelligence, which is a relatively recent discovery in the West.
God, I wish I had as much time as Tolstoy did. I would be reading so many more books. But that is a fascinating...
No, but emotional intelligence is part of the human brain, which has been discovered by psychologists. And it seems to me the Russians could do with a little bit of emotional intelligence.
Do you think that, based on what I've described in War and Peace, do you think Tolstoy exhibits emotional intelligence?
Well,
or does he still have some things to learn?
His characters, but whether he does in his marital life, I don't know.
Fair enough. Fair enough. My wife pointed out to me once. She said, "You write so beautifully about love in Tolstoy. Why can't you do that in real life. And my only defense is, he couldn't either.
I was just reading Daniel Goleman today, and he has a chapter on the costs of emotional illiteracy, for example. And I think that's a wonderful term to describe.
So let's talk about that more, because like I said, the second edition, I'm going to throw in things like this to make all my readers happy. But no, I did not. The term is not in the index, and I don't use it in the book.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could say a few words about translations, and you obviously have the ability to read it in the original and how it differs. But you seem to be reading an older version, not the latest, like the Volokhonsky and Pevir.
So, Knopf, who published the Pevir and Volokhonsky translation, were very clever. They made it look like the old translation. This is Pevir and Volokhonsky.
Oh, okay.
Published in 2007. This is not my original copy of War and Peace that I first discovered in 1989. I lost that. This is only a 7-year-old book. So you can imagine what it would look like if it was 14 years old, right? It'd be carrying it in a bag or something. So this is the translation that I do quote from in my book, and I also recommend it. But what I would say about translations is that sure, you're going to miss some nuances in some translations that you'll get in others. But Tolstoy is one of those writers that is very translatable because he was less interested in playing with language. He was less modern in that sense. He was very aware of language, but it was the meaning, it was the sense that he was trying to create. And so most translations do an adequate job of at least capturing that. But I would say that I think this translation does a little bit better of capturing it was this kind of combination of elegance and awkwardness in Tolstoy. A lot of the other translations try to Victorianize him, try to pacify his prose, which is very bold and as I mentioned, breaks a lot of rules. And this does not attempt to do that. It keeps it with all of its quirks and its quirkiness. But ultimately, you read the translation that'll make you want to get through the novel. I mean, that's the ultimate piece of advice. Some people love another translation, and I don't foist this one on them. I say, if that's the one that will make you want to read this novel from beginning to end, then read it. But this is the one that I would start with.
Did Tolstoy find warfare, actual war, as a necessary or even desirable feature in order to find truth in life?
Yes. Part of Tolstoy's interest in war stemmed from his own experience as a soldier. In his 20s, he was a soldier in the Caucasus during Russian expansion into the Caucasus, which is still in the area that is today Chechnya. This has been going on for 200 years. He also fought in the Crimean War of the 1850s. And so he had a lot of experiences with death on the battlefield, including experiences that he himself had. And I think later on in life he became a pacifist, a vehement pacifist. That was the time in which Gandhi was inspired by his writing. But when he was writing War and Peace, he was a realist. And he understood that war is a part of life. We all have egos. We all are selfish. We're all animals. We also have a spiritual dimension, and these two are in constant conflict. And so War and Peace is a drama of those two different dimensions of human reality, and I don't think Tolstoy privileges one over the other in War and Peace. I think what makes the book so powerful is his realization that this is all part of who we are and what history is. It is about conflict, yes, but there are also moments, those kind of transcendent moments like the ones that I've described in my talk.
When he was writing the book, was he aware of the American Civil War? Did American Civil War resonate at that time?
That's a fascinating question. He was certainly aware of it, and he was very well read. He was reading all of the newspapers. But I don't think And I know he wrote some things about it in letters and some correspondence, but I don't know of any specific moment in War and Peace that was directly referring to the American Civil War. No, and I say that seriously, because there's some very interesting parallels between what happened in Russia in the 1860s and what happened in America. Russia in the 1860s was an incredibly period. 1860s is when the novel was written. 1812 is when it takes place. It was an incredibly tumultuous time. A political divide between the conservatives and the liberals, and so he was writing at a time that was almost every bit as turbulent as the one that he was writing about. And so I don't know what parallels he made to the Civil War, but I think he was more focused on this is such a Russia-focused book that he probably wouldn't have found a way to squeak the Civil War in there. But that is an interesting question. I'm gonna look that up. I never got that question before.
Along with the inspiration that Tolstoy had for Gandhi and for Martin Luther King, he also is an inspiration, certainly for me as an educator, and for a whole series of educators, A.S. Neal, who wrote Summerhill, and many other thinkers and writers about education. I wondered if you have much to say about Tolstoy and education.
I'm happy to share what I know. I would love to hear more about your story. You don't hear that every day. People don't get up and say that Tolstoy was an inspiration to me as an educator, so I'm very fascinated by that. But as I'm sure you know, Tolstoy, before he started War and Peace, started a school for peasant children on his estate. Tolstoy actually looked at himself as a teacher, as an educator, before he was a novelist. He had abandoned literature altogether. He wasn't going to write War and Peace. He had settled down onto his estate. He got married in 1862, and he wanted to start the school for peasant children and find more effective ways to teach them. And he was so inspired by one of his peasant children, the way that 16-year-old wrote, the rawness and the authenticity of his writing, that Tolstoy said, I want to write a work like that is that raw, that is that authentic. So ironically, his own students inspired him. But he thought the entire Western educational system was bunk. He thought it was too hierarchical, too controlling.
As I do.
And as you do. So there we go. And above the door in the school, the peasant schoolhouse, were written the words, "Let the children go free." That was his motto. He was an anarchist. I don't know what actually happened in those classrooms, but the kids loved him because they showed up early the next day in their newly washed kaftans and they're ready to go. So he was definitely an engaging teacher. And he, as you mentioned, his experiments influenced a lot of people, including
A.S. Neal.
Well, including you. You're not A.S. Neal, are you? No.
Not that old.
This is a bit of a follow-on, and I'm still trying to formulate what is probably a very elementary question, but you talk about all the research he did, and obviously he mixes in real historical characters with his primary fictional characters, and was he primarily using fiction to illuminate history and historical forces, or using history to illuminate human nature?
Yes and yes. I mean, that's a huge question. One of the criticisms that this book has received is that Tolstoy intentionally distorts historical fact for his own purposes. So, for instance, he creates in the character of Kutuzov, he creates Kutuzov as a far more salt-of-the-earth kind of character than he actually was. Kutuzov was apparently much more wily, much more questionable in terms of his morals. So historians have accused Tolstoy of using history and distorting it for his own ends. I don't know what I don't know I don't know what I think about that, because the fact is that ultimately this is a work of fiction, and his goal was not just to illuminate history, but to illuminate life. and human nature. And so I think he was after something bigger. He even mentions it in a introduction to a draft of the novel. He's after something bigger than writing about history. He wants to write about what he calls the truth. And the truth requires imagination. It requires a little bit of playing around with the facts of reality and kind of putting them together in a different, more imaginative way. And apparently he was successful because during World War II, Soviet soldiers were given copies of War and Peace to read. And they claimed to be many of them claimed to be more moved. This was during Hitler's invasion of Russia. They claimed to be more moved by Tolstoy's description of war than the actual warfare that was taking place before their very eyes. And there are quotations to that effect. So there's something about Tolstoy's ability to take reality and make it even more real than reality itself. Wish I could write these questions down. Oh, we'll have a recording. Good.
My question's at least somewhat related to the American Civil War. Are you familiar with Tolstoy's comments about Abraham Lincoln? And if yes, I was just curious, what's your take on those? What do you think about those?
I'm not familiar. What are some specific ones you have in mind?
Well, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a best-selling book about Abraham Lincoln. And on the inside cover, I'm paraphrasing, but Tolstoy said that something to the effect of the moonlight of Alexander, Napoleon, and Caesar pale in the sunshine of Lincoln, and that Lincoln's a great and universal character who will live forever, greater than all other presidents combined and greater than his country. And then he told a story, I believe, to the New York Post when they went to interview him on Abraham Lincoln's 100th birthday. He said that he had been out meeting with classics, and they had asked him to tell them about great leaders, and he talked for 2 or 3 hours, and then all of a sudden this poor peasant Cossack stood up and said, well, you still haven't told us about the greatest leader of all time, the greatest general of all time, and his name was Lincoln, and he lived in a faraway land called America. So at the time, people thought that he just made that part up.
So that I had heard, but the other things you said before, never heard that. So thank you. I know Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to say about Tolstoy, and Tolstoy had some things to say about Teddy Roosevelt, which was a very different era in American history. But Tolstoy wrote letters to American thinkers and intellectuals at the time, urging them to rise up against the imperialist ethos of Teddy Roosevelt. At the end of in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then Teddy Roosevelt, for his part, had some problems with Anna Karenina, because he was Teddy Roosevelt was very conservative, and most of his comments were directed towards Anna herself, not towards Tolstoy, who is the adulteress in the novel. So that's an interesting article or dissertation right there, Roosevelt and Tolstoy. The legacy goes on. One more question.
Yes, with regard to Teddy Tolstoy, this is really incredible. Are you aware that Teddy Roosevelt took a copy of, I think it was War and Peace, along with him when in the dead of winter in 1886 in the Dakota Territory, he and 2 of his friends were hunting down the guys who had stolen his boat.
Amazing. It's a perfect book for that trip. Teddy Roosevelt. No, I knew Teddy Roosevelt had read War and Peace, but I didn't know specifically that he took a copy of War and Peace with him when he was on one of his cowboy expeditions.
The 3 thieves in what we now call North Dakota. Then the Dakota Territory in 1886, and then in these later years, that was one of the favorite events of his life that he loved to recount. When these two buddies were rowing down the river. Roosevelt took along a copy of I think it's Anna War and Peace or Anna Karenina, and then eventually they located the guys.
So it was Anna Karenina or War and Peace?
Yeah,
It should have been War and Peace.
It was probably War and Peace.
Okay.
And then thinking on the same lines, when in 1909 he and his son Kermit went on a safari in Kenya, Roosevelt took along about 50 books bound in pigskin to keep himself busy. And then one of the hunters that accompanied him said, as the safari was getting underway, said something like, I see you brought everything from your baggage to books. You always carry a library with you? And he said, oh yeah, I sure do. No matter where I am, I always have something to read.
I love historians. No, I didn't know all of these details. But War and Peace would be the perfect book to take with you on an expedition like that. And I think even more perfect than War and Peace, because it's awfully heavy. For your next trip, you need to take a copy of Give War and Peace a Chance.
Folding up your chairs and leaning against something solid. The books are available at the front, and Andrew will stay and sign some.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm happy to.
Book TV is on Facebook. Like us to interact with Book TV guests and viewers, watch videos, and get up-to-date information on events. Facebook.com